either 2 source-based questions and 1 essay, or 2 essays and 1 source-based question. Right. Let's start with our first question. The first question, we know the core focus is on civil resistance or on internal resistance to apartheid in the 1980s. We look at the different organizations that came into play to resist the rule of apartheid and to emancipate Black people in their fight against oppression from apartheid practices by the National Party government. Right. If we check our question here, the question is solely focused on civic organizations. When we're looking at civic organizations, we are looking at those groupings of people in the townships, including different organizations like the churches, community members coming together to rally behind the fight against oppression and the rule of apartheid. So the focus of this question number 1, is how did civic organizations mobilize local communities to resist apartheid government structures in South Africa in the 1980s? And remember, when you get such a focus of the question, that is where you're going to get your paragraph question, which is the last question, an 8-mark question for the source-based question. So as you read through the sources, as you extract information for the other questions, you should also try to figure out evidence which supports the question, because you will need it when you are answering the paragraph question as evidence. So you need to highlight wherever you find evidence of how civic organizations mobilized our local communities. It's evidence to the paragraph question, so that you don't waste time when you're answering the paragraph question. You just refer to the highlighted evidence that you would have got when you are looking for information to answer the other questions. Right, question number 1.11. Name the bill in the source that was introduced by the apartheid government in 1980 to create local government structures. Right, this one is an extraction question. Remember the setup of our questions. If you see a 1 by 1, it means it's an extraction question. It's a level 1 question where you don't need to scratch your head thinking of the response, but you go to the given source and you extract your response. Let's look at the response from the source. Right, if you check source 1A, how is it aligned? What is the context of the source? You should also be in a position to figure out the content in the source by reading the context of the source before you get into the source. The source below was written by D. Silnova, a research fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and faculty member of Higher School of Economics in Russia. It explores the reaction of civic organizations to the Black Local Authorities Act. That is the context of our source. So we want to find the response of the bill which was introduced by apartheid. If we go to our first part of our source, it says the government introduced the Black Local Government Bill in 1980. That is where we get our response. We get our response directly here. It says the Black Local Government Bill in 1980. That is our response to the first question, the Black Local Government Bill. Right, let's move on to the next question. Quote from the source, 2 provisions of the Black Local Authorities Act for Black residents in township. Again, it's a 2 by 1, which means it's also an extraction question. And what you should be aware of is that if it's 2 by 1, you are supposed to give 2 different responses, with each response weighing 1 mark. So you must get 2 different provisions from the source, which were provided through the Black Local Authorities Act. Right, if you go to our source, right, we tend to find that if we come here, it says it provided for the establishment of a series of local government structures similar to those operating in white areas. This was one provision. It provided for the establishment of a series of local government structures which were similar to those operating in the white areas. Right. This implies that the government was in a position to manipulate Black people into thinking that they are having their own autonomy in the townships. They were given the mandate to form their own structures to govern themselves. But however, those structures did not have any parliamentarian representation. So They were just structures to govern the affairs of Black people in the townships, but without any say in national issues or national affairs. It was just local affairs which were supposed to be managed and governed by those authorities in the townships. That was one provision. Let's look at the other provision. It continues and says, and for the first time, it, referring to the bill, gave African residents of urban locations something like autonomy. So that is the other provision. It gave African residents of urban locations something like autonomy, which is self-government. So Black people were made into believing that they were self-governing themselves. They were having power over their own affairs. But however, their power was only localized. It had nothing to do with national affairs. They were made to decide only their local affairs affecting them in the townships, but did not have any say on issues concerning the country at large. So those were the provisions that were made through the bill, the Black Local Government Bill of 1980. Right. So we move on to the next question. List N3 problems according to the source that the newly formed civic organizations were meant to tackle or solve in their local communities. Right, again, if you check, it's a 3x1, it's a level 1 question. This question, again, is an extraction question where you are supposed to find information from the source. You're supposed to just go to the source and extract the relevant information. We want 3 problems that were supposed to be solved by the civic organizations in their local communities. Right, if we come to our source here, what does it say? Right. Right, the second paragraph talks about the emergence of the Black local authorities, the civic organizations mushrooming or growing, right? And then, right, it talks about the committees that were formed, like the block committees, the yard committees, and the street committees. They were also formed. Then we go to where we find our response. If we come to the last statement of our second paragraph, it says, these were formed. We're looking at those local authorities. They were formed to tackle specific problems. What were the problems that were meant to be tackled? Number 1 was high rentals. And number 2 was poor electrification. Problem number 3 was bad housing. Problem number 4 was the bucket toilet system. And problem number 5 was crime. So if we check, we have a list of 5 problems that were meant to be solved by the local authorities, by the civic organizations. Right. So, which means you're supposed to highlight any 3 of those, despite of the order or despite of which one you pick, but you're supposed to have at least identified 3 of those 5 listed problems. Problem number 1 was high rentals. The municipalities were increasing the rents for the properties that they owned where Black people were staying. And number 2, there was poor electrification. The townships did not receive adequate electricity. They were not electrified. So there were the challenge of electrification. They were supposed to tackle that problem as the local authority. Then there was also bad housing, which is also still a legacy of apartheid in South Africa. Those municipality-owned properties, they were very poor in terms of the amenities and also in terms of the appearance of the structures. So there was bad housing and also the problem of the bucket toilet system, which was also prevalent during then because of poor sanitary facilities and poor water provision. And also there was the problem of crime. So those were the problems that were meant to be addressed by those local authorities. Right. Let's go on to the next question. So that one was an instruction question. Then if you look at question number 1.14, comment on what is implied by the statement. When a question says comment, it requires you to engage with the source and also engage with your own knowledge. Comment on what is implied by the statement. Addressing these bread and butter issues automatically drove them, referring to the civic organizations, to political issues in their townships. So the question is rather saying, what is the meaning of that statement? Or What's the implication of that statement on the situation which was there in the townships? Addressing these bread and butter issues. What are bread and butter issues? We are saying the civic organizations, they were supposed to tackle their daily problems for survival. The bread and butter issues we are referring to, the basic issues that were affecting ordinary life of the people in the townships. They were affected by the basic issues like high rentals. They could not afford to pay the rents, or the problem of crime in the townships, or those problems that we have highlighted. So they were supposed to address those problems. But what was the situation in an effort to address those problems? It drove them into political issues in their townships. So what does that mean? You are trying to address a basic problem for the betterment of your living conditions in the township. But at the same time, you are ending up being engaged in political issues. So the question here, if we are to draw the meaning of that statement, we are saying in an effort to attain decent living, the civic organizations were targeting for an ordinary Black South African to achieve a decent life. But however, they ended up confronting the government for the neglect to address these basic needs for them. It was the duty of the government, the national government in that manner, to address those problems. So they were now trying to address those problems on their own. But later on, what happened in the effort to address those problems, they ended up being in confrontation with the government, which is now political. We want a decent life. That is a bread and butter issue. We want the rentals to be reasonable and economic so that we can afford. Who is supposed to make us afford the rentals is the government. So we end up confronting the government in an effort to address those problems. So it's an issue of addressing the basic needs, but at the same time, it's leading the people into confronting the government. In solving the problems of basic needs, you ended up engaging in a fight with the government or engaging in disputes with the government, because it was the duty of the government to make sure that the citizens are well taken care of. But however, there was neglect because of the separate development policy by the apartheid government. So that is the literal meaning. That is the meaning of that particular statement. If you are to take it from the perspective of what was happening in the townships during that era of the 1980s. Right. So that is the first question. The first part of the question, number 1.1. Let's go to the next source. Source 1B. Why do you think this poster was created? Let's go to the poster. Right. Why do you think a poster was created? You check the context of the source. Before you answer the question, check the context of the source and be able to figure out what the source is about. You get a clue of the usefulness of the source or why the source was created. If you are saying why the source was created, we are saying what is the usefulness of that particular source. So let's check the context of this source. It says the poster below, produced by Krugersdorp Residents Organization, appeared on a South African History Archive. It called for the residents' meeting to be held at the Roman Catholic Church in Kagiso on 27 January 1985. Right, so why was the poster created? Is its usefulness? What is it meant to address? It is meant to call for residents' meeting. So we get the usefulness here, or the why part, to call for the residents' meeting to be held at the Roman Catholic Church in Kagiso. That is number one. It was created to call for a residents' meeting. Then what else can we say? We can also say it was meant to conscientize Blacks of the need to have their problems addressed. Because remember, the role of this meeting was to get Black people gather and discuss critical issues concerning their livelihoods. So it was also meant to conscientize the Black people of the need to have their problems addressed. They were supposed to have their problems addressed. And who was supposed to address those problems? It was the role of the Black people in collaboration with the civic associations. And also we can say the poster was created to show Black people's discontent with apartheid. Creating this poster it was a way of showing that black people were not happy with apartheid rule. They show their discontent. And also we can say the poster was created to call for support from the public, the black public. To call for support. If people are being called for a meeting and the meeting is for a common cause to address problems affecting your livelihoods, then people would rally behind the civic associations. So we can say it was meant to call for the residents' meeting as in the context of the source, and also to conscientize black people if they need to have their problems addressed, or to show black people's discontent with the apartheid rule, or to rally for support from the black public. Right. We move on to the next question. Explain why it is important for Dr. Motlana to speak about the role of civic associations during the residents' meeting. Right. We are looking at this poster here. It has the title, this particular character, Dr. Motlana, and also Isaac Jenu. These are the co-participants in the upcoming meeting. They are most likely to be the people to address the meeting, to tell the people the motive of the meeting, the agenda of the meeting, and why they want people's problems addressed. And so why is it important for them to explain to the public the role of civic associations? Right. If we come to our question, we want Dr. Motlana to speak about the role of civic association during the residents' meeting. Right. The first thing there basically is to make black people aware of the role of civics. He must explain the role that is supposed to be played by the civic association. People need to know, because some people would just be exposed to the idea of the civic association for the first time. They don't know what kind of an association it is, what is it going to help, how is it going to help them, or why was it created, what's the rationale for having that association. So there is need to conscientize black people of the role of civics. Black people need to know. So it's important for them to explain so that people get to know. And also to mobilize for mass support. Mobilization of mass support. If they clearly explain the purpose of the civic associations, then people will rally behind those associations and they will gain more support. So it's important for them to also explain the role so that there is the garnering of support from the public. People would support the organizations and it will have massive impact on the apartheid government. And also to give people hope. Remember, some people were now hopeless. Because of apartheid, they were exposed to all forms of oppression, and they no longer had any hope for the better in life. They were now thinking of them being in a dead end, and them being not in any position to challenge apartheid. So it was also meant, if they would explain the role of civic associations, it would also assist in giving people hope about the future. Right, that was source 1B. Let's quickly go on to source 1C. I'll start source 1C. Right, let's go and check source 1C. What is it about? Our source 1C is, the extract below is from Soweto, Our Land. The mayor by J. Seroke, the Pan-Africanist and cadre of the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, published in 2021. It focuses on the Tembisa rent boycott in the mid-1980s and the creation of the state to those perceived to be the reaction of the state to those are perceived to be its leaders. Right. Let's go to our question. The first question, identify the organization in the source that supported the rent and service compliance of Tembisa residents. Right, if we go to that one there, I think that one is a level 1 question. which is a simple question, an extraction, a 1 by 1. We want an organization that was that supported the rent and service complaints. Right. We go to our source. It says in the 1980s, the Azanian People's Organization pitched up to lead action supporting the rent and service complaints of the Tembisa residents. So our answer is just here. We extract the Azanian People's Organizations, or in short, AZAPO. That was the organization. Our response to the first question. We go on to the next question. Why do you think Jaki Seroke was detained by the South African police officer Van Niekerk a day after Tembisa residents marched against rent and services? Right. We are looking at a situation here where a person who is influential against the resistance to apartheid, who is mobilizing marches against the rent and services, being arrested by the police and being detained at the police station. Why did the police detain that particular individual? That one there, we can reason out of the source information using our own knowledge of why the police officers were detaining influential people in the Black societies, especially after specific events of showing discontent to the government, like those marches. After a march, then we find one of the affluent members of the organizations leading the marches being detained by the police. Right. Let's come here. It says, in the early hours the following day, I, Jaki Seroke, was picked up at home by my own adversary or my own enemy, South African police officer Van Niekerk, and detained or jailed under the General Law Amendment Act. And this allowed for 14 days detention while the police worked out a charge. So we are saying, why was he taken? Why was he put into detention? Right. Based on what we are seeing there, that guy was detained. Why? The reason was to remove him from society so that he would not influence more people to protest. Remember, there was a protest, a march for the services and for rent. Then him being perceived as a leader or as an influencer of the marches against the government, he was supposed to be removed from society. So they did it deliberately to remove him from society so that he would not influence more people. And also we would say he was detained to instill fear amongst the protesters. If one of the key members is arrested and detained, it will mean that the rest of the people will also be fearing for the same, which will mean that they will not continue with the same action. So it was also meant to instill fear amongst the protesters, or we can also say to suppress the progress of the march, since he was influential in mobilizing masses. So for the government to suppress, well, it was a way of repression. To suppress resistance through marches, they had to detain those who were purported to be the leaders of the marches. So basically, you can argue around those reasons as an argument to why he was detained by the police. Right. Let's move on to the next question. The next question is saying, according to the source, give N3 stipulations of the General Law Amendment Act with regard to the treatment of the detainees. Right, this one is an extraction question. We want 3 stipulations. We are talking of stipulations. We are looking at what was allowed through the General Law Amendment. What were the provisions that were given through that law? Or how did it operate? So if we go to our source, right, we tend to find that it says this allowed for 14 days detention while police worked out a charge. So it's the first provision, allowing for 14 days. It allowed for 14 days detention while the police worked out a charge. It's one provision. The police were given the powers through that amendment to detain people without a charge for 14 days, while they were trying to establish a charge. So which meant it was some form of unfairness, because why would you arrest someone in the first place if there's no charge? Someone, if arrested, must be tried in the courts of law and not detained for such long by the police. But however, because it was during apartheid, they would amend the laws to suit their needs. And what else? That was number one, allowed for 14 days detention. And also it says detainee could be held in solitary confinement or in isolation. It's another provision that they would keep the detainee in confinement or in isolation. You would not be allowed to mix with anyone or to mix with the public or to engage with other people. Rather, you must be staying in isolation alone if you are having a case to answer with the police. And lastly, the detainee also was not allowed to access to lawyers or doctors during that time. You would not be allowed to access lawyers or doctors during that particular time, which meant that if you had health complications, you would die in detention. No lawyers would represent you in the courts of law during the time of detention. It was another provision. Right? And also the other provision, the 14 days could be extended indefinitely without end. It was another provision. The police also could extend the period of 14 days, could be extended indefinitely without end. So you pick any three there. That is where you get the provisions. So the 14-day detention, while the police are establishing a charge, then the detainee could be held in solitary confinement or in isolation. It's another provision. And also the fact that the detainee would not be allowed access to lawyers or doctors during that particular time of detention, another provision. Or the 14 days could be extended indefinitely without end. So those were the provisions of the General Law Amendment Act. Right, we'll move on to the next question. Next question is talking about a definition. Define the term rent boycott. Right, this is a common term, a common historical term that you should be able to define. Right, and when you're defining terms, we rely on the concept. You must address the basic requirements of the concept. Right, when you're talking of a boycott, before we talk of the rent boycott, we are looking at boycotting in general. When you're talking of boycotting, you are saying you refuse to take part in a particular event. You refuse to take part or to be involved in a particular event. You are supposed to be involved in a particular event, then you refuse to participate or refuse to be part of that particular event. That is boycotting. So we have different forms of boycotts. Like during the 1980s, Black people were using two common boycotts. They were using the rent boycott and the consumer boycott. So when I'm talking of the rent boycott, we know well that Black people or the Black men who were supposed to be working in the cities and towns, they had to stay in rented apartments which were owned by the local governments and in some instances owned by the national government. Right, the municipalities were the ones owning mainly the flats where Black men were supposed to stay while they were on their work contracts in the cities and towns. And remember, they were supposed to pay rents. They were supposed to pay rentals for those spaces and for those apartments where they were staying. But however, because of the discontent with apartheid, they decided not to pay rent for those apartments. So when we talk of a rent boycott, we are looking at a situation where Black people refused to pay rent for the properties that they were staying or for the apartments that they were staying, which were owned by the government. or by the municipalities. They refused deliberately to pay rent. That is a rent boycott. So whichever way, as long as you address it as a concept, you can define it in your own understanding, but it should address the fact of refusing to pay rentals. Right. We'll move to the next question. Explain why those opposed to the rent boycotts were regarded as puppets of the township superintendent. Right. We know of the black-to-black violence, which was typically experienced in the townships, where black men were fighting against their fellow black people because of the accusations that there were some people who were spies amongst the black people, who were sellouts to the white apartheid government, who were giving information, confidential information to the white government. So there were instances of black-to-black violence because of those people. So we are looking at some people opposing the rent boycotts. Remember, the movement was to liberate the black person, and there was supposed to be collective effort in the bid to try and liberate the black people from oppression. But however, there were some other black people amongst the same society who were working in favor of the needs of the apartheid or the oppressor by that same time. So why those opposed to the rent boycotts were regarded as puppets of the township superintendent? And also the other key aspect, you should understand what a puppet is. Right, when we're talking of a puppet here, we are looking at someone who is acting on behalf of their superior. You are being made to do whatever you do is in the direction of your superior, who is having ultimate control over your actions. So why are we regarding those people as the puppets of the township superintendent? Right. We can argue that they were regarded as such because they wanted to please the township superintendent by paying rent while others are refusing to pay rent. What is the intention there? You want to be a good person to the township superintendent, but however, not forgetting that the township superintendent was an oppressor. So it was an effort they were working to please the township superintendent, or whatever they were doing it to please the township superintendent. So it was not out of their will, but they were doing it so that they will please the township superintendent or the white government. You pay rent while others are refusing to pay rent. Then also, we can also say they were working against the general will of blacks. Black people wanted liberation from oppression, and they wanted better living conditions. They were tackling bread and butter issues by refusing to pay rent. So these ones, they were working against the general will of the black people. That was why they were regarded as puppets. Working against the will of the black people. Or we can also argue why they were regarded as puppets. They worked in favor of the oppressor. Remember that the amount of money that was raised through the rentals was not given to the local structures in the black townships. The money would go to development of the areas deemed to be white areas. And the problem with that was you take resources from an area which is neglected. The townships were underdeveloped because the apartheid government was adopting a policy of separate development. They would not want to develop black areas. They would neglect them and at the same time taking resources from them. The black men would work for the white person, get paid, and still pay back the money to the white person again in the form of rent. And the white person would use that money to develop their own areas, which was unfair. And then we are seeing someone who is working in favor of the oppressor, who is paying the oppressor to develop themselves while these two are being neglected. So they were regarded as puppets in that direction because they were working in favor of the oppressor. So that one is a 2x2, which means you can engage with sources and you also need to engage with your own knowledge. Right, let's go to the next question. Quote 2 reasons from the source why township residents in the Val could not afford to pay rent. That is number 1.41. Right, we check our source. We are going to the last source. We want to check the context of the source and be able to figure out evidence from the source. Right, is the extract below is from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report published on 29 October 1998. It explains how civic organizations that were at the forefront of protests action in townships faced violent repression from the South African government. That's the context of the source. Right. So we want to find evidence to our question. We want 2 reasons why the residents in the VAL could not afford to pay rent. Right. If we go to our source, it states here. Right. Rent boycotts were launched in townships across the VAL following the announcement of rent increase by Black local authority. Now under some pressure to meet their budget deficits or shortfalls and become self-financing. Township residents could not afford to pay the rapidly escalating rising rents they were expected to pay. The 56% increase announced by the Likoa Town Council affected at least 300,000 people in the VAL who were already paying some of the highest rents in the country, half of which were in arrears. So if you check the first paragraph there, it has all the information that we need to justify why people in the VAL were failing to pay renters. Right. If we look at the first part here, it says township residents could not afford to pay the rapidly escalating rents that they were expected to pay. This is one piece of evidence. The rapidly escalating or rising rents that they were expected to pay. Meaning to say, the rents were rising rapidly and way above the capacity to earn money of the residents. At the end of the day, they had no option, but rather not to pay the rent. They had to boycott because not out of defiance, but because of the economic situation. The rents were escalating. They were rising very fast, and they could not catch up with the pace of the rise in the rentals. And at the end, they had no option. Rather, they were supposed to boycott the rents. And also, if we check here, following the announcement of increase by Black local authority, of rent increase by Black local authority, after the announcement, the rent increased. The Black local authorities, they increased the rent. And also there's justification here where it says it affected at least 300,000 people in the VAL who were already paying some of the highest rents in the country. The rents were the highest, the whole of South Africa, for the people in the VAL. So they could not afford to pay such rents because some of them were already in arrears. Half of the 300,000 were having arrears. They did not clear the backlog of their rents, which were due. And at the same time, they were supposed to pay those escalating high renters. So they had no option but to boycott the rents because they could no longer afford, for such a reason that the rentals were too high. And they were high to the extreme that they were the highest across the whole spectrum of South African society. So they had no option but rather to boycott for those reasons. Right, it's an extraction question. The reasons, we find them from the source. We got the next question. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, comment on why there were many township councillors who resigned in 1984. But let's try to check and get the context of local councillors resigning. Right. Paragraph number 2, it says, Opposition organized through civic and student organizations proliferated or multiplied. Attacks on councillors trying to implement the rent increase by black local authorities intensified or grew, leading to the resignation of many in 1984. Right. So we are seeing the context there of councillors resigning from their positions in around 1984. Why? The first reason is there. It talks about attacks on councillors trying to implement the rent increase. That was again black-to-black violence in the townships. Black councillors, they were being attacked by their own fellow black men and women for them trying to implement the rent increases. For them trying to make black people pay the high rentals, some of them ended up losing their lives, being attacked by their very own black people because they were working in favor of the apartheid government. Blacks were tackling bread and butter issues. They were in a very critical situation, an economic crisis. And at the same time, someone is coming and trying to influence you to pay those high rentals. So there were attacks on the black councillors in the townships. So most of them, they opted to resign from those positions because it was now a threat for them to keep working as councillors in the townships, or they would be attacked by their fellow black people in the townships. And what else can we argue? We can also argue that many of those councillors, given the situation, they felt like they were betraying the common cause of the blacks by working for the white government. Black people are working towards their liberation, and there are some black councillors who are working for the government, the very same oppressive government. So some of them, they got to feel like they are going against the will of their own country by working for the government. So they chose to quit their job for the sake of going forward with the will of the majority. And also we can argue on the economic perspective that the economic conditions did not spare them. They were not spared from the economic hardships in the townships. So there was no need for them to keep supporting a situation which was non-beneficial to their side. There was hardship in the townships. The lives of the people in the townships were negatively impacted by separate development by the apartheid government. So them were not also spared. They were also exposed to harsh economic conditions. And at the end of the day, there was no more incentive for them to keep working for the very same oppressive government. And they opted to resign from their positions in 1984. Right, then remember also it's a 2-by-2 question. A 2-by-2, you are supposed to identify or come out with two different responses which are fully developed. Right, number 143, it says, explain the concept of a massacre in the context of the government's reaction to rent protesters in Mamelodi. Right, it talks about a massacre for the Mamelodi protesters in the last paragraph. Violent government reaction to rent protests culminated or ended in police shooting on marchers on 21 November 1985 in Mamelodi, where 13 people died. Most victims were shot in the back. So we get the context of a massacre from this statement here, which talks about police shooting and giving a specific incident of the 21 November 1985 incident in Mamelodi, where 13 people died. And how did those people die? Most victims were shot in the back. Remember also we have the Sharpeville massacre. It's a typical example of a massacre in South Africa, which is a very pronounced massacre which led to an ultimate turning point to the history of South African politics. Right. So when you're talking of a massacre here, when you're defining it as a concept, but however, it should have the basics of it being a concept. So in my definition, I would define it as a massacre, the killing of a considerable Number of people. With indiscriminate violence. So in a massacre, we are saying there's a killing of a considerable number. If you look at this one here, it's 13. 13 people being killed in one event. That is a very big number for people to die. And why were they dying? They were dying for marching. And how did they die? They were shot in the back. Which means when you're looking at a massacre, it's indiscriminate violence. If someone is shot in the back, it means the police opened fire to people who were already running away from them. If someone is attacking, it means they were supposed to shoot from the front, but they were shot from the back, meaning to say it was indiscriminate. They were just indiscriminately causing violence against the black people by shooting them while they were already running away from the police. So the aspect of a massacre, we need to address that there is killing of people, and how are those people killed? In most instances, those people won't be harmful or they won't be armed, but rather there is indiscriminate violence. We just use unrestricted violence on people and ending up killing numbers of people. Right. We move on to the next question. Why would a historian regard this source as useful when researching apartheid's government's reaction to boycotts in townships? And we're looking at usefulness here, right? When you want to identify usefulness, you can also check in the context of the source. It explains how civic organizations that were at the forefront of protest action in townships faced violent repression. So it is usefulness. What is the source providing is its usefulness. It explains how civic organizations that were at the forefront of protest action in townships faced violent repression. It's one of the usefulness here. You get it from the context of the source. What is the source telling us about? Is the usefulness of the source. Then we can also say the other usefulness. It gives the exact dates of the Mamelodi massacre. We are told that marches on 21 November 1985. This is useful information. You get to know the exact date when the event happened. It gives us the exact date of when the Mamelodi incident occurred. And also, you can also talk of the source giving us the number of people who were killed, who were massacred. It tells us that there were 13 people who were killed. This is information which is useful. We get to get the details, or we get tangible information or tangible matter to the event. We know that there were 13 people killed through that source. It's usefulness. It also gives us the reaction by councillors, the reaction of blacks to councillors in the townships. We are told that there was attack on councillors. It's useful information. We get to know councillors were being attacked. It's another useful information. And also, if you check, it gives us the cost of the boycott on the government. It says here, by August 1987, it was estimated that rent boycotts in the PWV, which is the Pretoria, Witwatersrand, and Vernaken, had cost more than 188 million, which meant that the government lost a lot of money from the boycotts. People refusing to pay rent. The government was supposed to have received 188 million, but however, it did not get that money because people were refusing to pay the rent. So it's also useful information. It gives us the cost of the boycott on the government. It's very useful information, right? So we have those as part of usefulness of the source. We go to refer to sources 1B and 1D, explain how the information in source 1B supports the evidence in source 1D regarding the protests against black local authorities in the 1980s. Right, what we want to check here, we want to check on how the information in those two sources supports each other. Source 1B supports evidence in source 1D. So we are saying what is common in those two sources? What is similar? What information is corroborating between those two sources? So we have to find information in source 1B and also find information in source 1D, which appears the same or which is common. Right. If we check in source 1B, it's a poster. Let's go to source 1B. Source 1B is a poster. Now remember, we have this poster here. This is source 1B. And source 1D is a text source. Right. So source 1B is a poster calling for residents meeting. Like here we can see residents meeting is calling for the people of around Krugersdorp to rally to Kakiso for a meeting on 27 January 1985. How is that poster calling for a meeting linking to source 1D? Source 1D is talking about opposition, which is organized through civic and student organizations. Right. If we check source 1D is talking of opposition organized through civic and student organizations. Krugersdorp Student Association was one of the civic organizations which was calling for opposition. And we are seeing in the first source, in source 1B, they are calling for a meeting. Definitely for that meeting, it was a meeting for mobilization for people to resist. So they are corroborating, they are connecting to each other. So when you are comparing, you say source 1D shows this or says this, which is supported by source 1D, which says this. And then if you go again to source 1B, it talks about the Krugersdorp Residents Organization. If we go here, it gives us the name of the civic organization. This one, Krugersdorp Residents Organization. How is it linking with this one here? We're looking at a civic organization. This one also talks of civic and student organization. So source 1B gives us the name of a civic organization, which was the Krugersdorp Residents Organizations. This is supported by source 1D, which says opposition was organized through civic organizations. They are agreeing with each other. And again, you can go to source 1B. Source 1B gives us this picture here, the picture of people marching. It portrays people marching. Like if I see these people here, they are on a march. And again, if we come here, it talks about, go to source 1D, it also talks about marches. It talks about this common march which led to the massacre. So you find information in the first source and show how it is also supported in the other source. And also you can also figure out that there was the Krugersdorp residents. This one, the Krugersdorp residents organization. Source 1 B talks of the Krugersdorp residents organizations calling for a gathering, a residents meeting. And what about Krugersdorp? There, if we check here, Krugersdorp is also appearing as one of the townships where the rent boycotts were launched. So we have a Krugersdorp civic organization in the first source, mobilizing people, and also Krugersdorp here is being mentioned as one of the townships where the boycotts were launched. So it's supporting each other in that direction. Right, so you just have to figure out two similarities there. You give two different responses, which show how those two sources support each other. Right, going on to the next question. This one now is a paragraph question. We just have to discuss the basics of answering a paragraph question using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge. Write a paragraph of about 8 lines explaining how civic organizations mobilized local communities to resist apartheid government structures. Like what I mentioned before we started, we said the context of the question is the one which is going to be asked in the paragraph question, which means as you answer the other sources, source questions, you must be able to figure out evidence which you are going to use in the paragraph question. So, like as usual, when you are answering a paragraph question, remember, you should always answer it in PIL format. PIL format meaning to say, your first part or your opening statement must give a clear statement answering the question. You must have a point, or you must have a line of argument, which is a direct response to the question. The question is saying, explaining how civic organizations mobilized Black local communities. So the question is asking you, or when you're adopting a line of argument, are you saying the civic organizations did mobilize Black people, or were effective in mobilizing Black people, or succeeded in mobilizing Black people? Or you are saying they failed, or they did not have any impact on mobilizing Black people? And you must be having evidence to that. So in this instance, it is evident that civic organizations were effectively able to mobilize local communities to resist apartheid, or they did succeed or greatly influenced mobilized Black local communities to resist apartheid government structures. So that is your line of argument or your answer to the question. We are saying the civic organizations, they were effective, or they were indeed successful in mobilizing Black people. Then you go on to explain. This is your line of argument. You must have an answer to the question. Then you go on to explain. You explain in your own words. You are not extracting information from the sources. You are explaining in your own understanding. Explain your understanding of how civic organizations were mobilizing Black local communities. Like you can explain that the civic organizations, they were able to mobilize Black people to engage in marches against poor service provision in the townships. Or they were able to mobilize people to engage in Black-to-Black violence on spies, on sellouts, people who were spying on the Black movements. Or you can also explain that the civic organizations were able to mobilize Black people to engage in consumer boycotts. They were able to mobilize Black people to refuse buying from white-owned shops and from shops of those collaborators who were working with the apartheid government. You are explaining. Then you go on to giving evidence. The evidence you just extract from the sources. Like, for example, they called for meetings with residents. You quote your source. This one is source 1B. We have evidence that the Krugersdorp civic organization was calling for a meeting of the residents. Or they created posters for awareness. There's a poster there, source 1B is a poster. It was their duty, mobilizing people. What else? They formed committees in source 1A. Talks about the block or the yards and the street committees. They were trying to create unity amongst the Black people so that they strengthen themselves against apartheid. It's source 1A. You give your source in brackets, source 1A. You find there's a lot of evidence. We cannot exhaust it. We can also talk of the rent boycotts were launched in source 1D. Rent boycotts were launched. And you can also add information on the impact of the rent boycotts. The government was negatively impacted by the rent boycotts. They lost that much. It's evidence to support that the civic organizations were able to mobilize Black people against oppression. Then you go on to your last part, which is the link. Show that whatever you said in the line of argument was proved by the paragraph. Or you can conclude your paragraph. You can tie up your paragraph by saying this effectively proves the impact of civic organization on mobilizing Black people, mobilizing resistance. It's clear your tying up of the paragraph where said they were effective in mobilizing Black people, and you explain how they did the mobilization, and you give evidence from the sources how they were engaging people to fight against unjust laws of apartheid. Then you link back to your line of argument in the end by showing how the above evidence corresponds to your line of argument. You tie up your paragraph with a linking statement. So that is how you answer the paragraph question. Right. We move on to the next question. Question number 2. How was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, able to bring closure to Sizwe Kondile's family for his murder as an anti-apartheid activist in 1981? Right, let's go to the source and figure out how the TRC dealt with the case of the murdered Kondile, Sizwe Kondile. Right. Source 2A. The source below is an extract from the TRC's report published in 1988. It highlights Sizwe Kondile, political life, and how he fled to exile in Lesotho in 1980. Right. What is our first question? According to the source, when did Sizwe Kondile and 5 others form an underground ANC cell inside the country? 1 by 2, it means we have to we have to find, to engage with the source, right? According to the source, we want to find when. It says here, the first statement, the second line in the first paragraph, in conduct with the African National Congress, the ANC in Lesotho, Kondile and 5 others formed an underground ANC cell inside the country in about July 1980. Now, we should be very careful with this kind of question. The when part is looking at the time factor, and the time factor is not very specific. It says in about July 1980. That is when the underground cell was formed. It's not exactly July 1980, which means July 1980 is most probably a wrong answer because it's not specific. It was around that time. In about July means maybe it was in August or maybe it was in June, but it was around July. It's a matter of an estimate time, not a specific time frame. So you just extract it as it is there in about July 1980. Right, we move on to the next question. Number 212. Name 3 of Sizwe Kondile's cell members in the source who decided to leave the country in September 1980. Right, we want 3 of Sizwe Kondile's cell members in the source who decided to leave the country in 1980. It's an extraction. We just want those 3 individuals. Right. It says here when two members of the cell, Mr. Tembi Miyabo and Mr. Nangamson Dube were arrested, Kondile and the other cell members, in brackets, decided to leave the country in September 1980, which means those ones in the brackets are the ones who left the country in September 1980. Right. It talks about Mr. Vusimuzi Pikoli. It talks about Mr. Tozi Majola and Mr. Paki Shimia. Those are the 3 individuals. As indicated in the source is just extraction. Right, the next one. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why Kondile and his friend undertook a mission to move back and forth between Lesotho and South Africa. Right, let's check. They were not stationed in either South Africa or in Lesotho, but they were moving up and down, South Africa, Lesotho, South Africa, Lesotho. Why were they doing that? Right. It says here, they went to Maseru, Lesotho, where they met with former Port Elizabeth Black Civic Organization leader Misty, Tozamile Botha, and Mr. Chris Hani. They were given basic training and told to build the underground movement in the Eastern Cape. This involved moving back and forth between Lesotho and South Africa. So why were they supposed to move up and down South Africa and Lesotho? Right, the reason number one, we can say, they had received basic training and had to move to South Africa to train others. Which means after receiving basic training in Lesotho, they were also supposed to come and train others in South Africa, in the Eastern Cape. So they're not supposed to stay in Lesotho, but rather to come in South Africa to train others. And also, they had to come to South Africa to initiate the building of the underground movement. It's another reason why they had to move from Lesotho coming to South Africa. They were supposed to form an underground movement. They would not form it while it's in Lesotho. They had to come here physically and form the underground movement. And what was the reason for them again moving from South Africa to go back to Lesotho? Again, they were not safe staying in South Africa for the whole time. Because remember, they were targets of the apartheid government. So given that they would come to the Eastern Cape, they would not come and stay there for good. They were supposed to again go into exile. So at the end of the day, they were faced with the mission of moving South Africa to Lesotho and Lesotho to South Africa for that reason. Right. Number 214, define the term traitor in your own words. A traitor in your own words, that is a concept. I can define it as someone who betrays any confidence or trust. If you are betraying confidence or trust, you are a traitor. Betray confidence or trust. Someone who betrays. You are given trust, you're entrusted in something, or you are given confidential information and you betray, you sell it out, you're a traitor. Or we can say, is one who assists an enemy in conquering their very own country. You assist the enemy to conquer yourself, your own country. You are a sellout. That's a traitor. Someone who is working in favor of the enemy against their very own country. Right. We go to the next source. Right. The next source is on extract is from the book titled Coming to Terms, South Africa's Search for Truth by M. Meredith. It focuses on the testimony given to the TRC by apartheid-era security police regarding the murder of Sizwe Kondile and how his mother rejected a DCOTC request for forgiveness. Right. What is the first question? Name 3 senior officers of the South African police in the source who admitted to the murder of Sizwe Kondile. Right. That one is an extraction question. We'll get the responses from the paragraph. Right. We want those 3. Right. 3 senior officers: Van Rensburg, Du Plessis, and their commanding officer, Colonel Gerrit Erasmus. We have them here. 1, 2, and 3. They admitted to the murder, but denied that Kondile has been killed because he had suffered brain damage during interrogation. So that one is the response. Right, move on to the next question. Explain the term testimony in the context of application for amnesty. What is a testimony in the context of application for amnesty? Right, we can say a testimony is a statement or an account of first-hand experience. An account or is a statement of first-hand experience. It's what actually happened, first-hand experience, something that someone witnessed. So it's an experience, it's a statement of first-hand experience. Which was given by perpetrators before the TRC so that they could be granted forgiveness. For you to be granted forgiveness, you're supposed to give a testimony. You're supposed to give an account of first-hand experience. What happened exactly? You're supposed to fully disclose what happened in a testimony. So that is a testimony when someone is fully disclosing or someone is giving a first-hand account of what happened or is giving a statement of what happened so that the TRC would grant them forgiveness. That is a testimony in that context. The next question, using the information in the source and your own knowledge. No, sorry, before that, comment on the meaning of the statement. If you were really remorseful or sorry, you wouldn't apply for amnesty, but in fact, stand trial for what you did regarding the court's request for forgiveness. Right, it's Condoleezza's mother who gave that statement to Kotsi who wanted to apply for amnesty. Right. So what's the implication of that statement? It's written here. At the end of this testimony, Dikotsi turned towards Cherit Kondile to ask for forgiveness, saying he hoped to meet her one day, to look her in the eye. Miss Kondile's lawyer, Imran Musa, gave a swift response. You have said you would like to meet Miss Kondile and look her in the eye. It is an honor she feels you do not deserve. And if you were really remorseful or sorry, you wouldn't apply for amnesty, but in fact, stand for trial for what you did. This is an account of the lawyer who was responding to the plea by Dikotsi to ask for forgiveness from the murdered Condoleezza's mother was Charit. Right. So what is the meaning of that? He meant, the lawyer meant that he was not supposed to seek for forgiveness, but rather pay for his sins. He was not supposed to ask for forgiveness if he was sorry, because he did that deliberately. And he was not supposed to ask for forgiveness, but rather was supposed to meet the consequences of his sins. Or we can say in other dimensions, they wanted retributive justice to take its course. Meaning to say retributive justice, they wanted him to be charged for what he did. They wanted him to go before the courts of law and be tried for the crime that he committed. Or we can say in another perspective, he committed act of atrocities that did not deserve him seeking for forgiveness. What he did was an act of great cruelty against humanity, and that did not deserve forgiveness. That can be attributed to as part of the response to that question. Right, we move on to the next question. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, state why you think Charit Kondile came to the conclusion that she could not forgive Dikotsi for what he did to her son. She could not give. Right, let's go to the source and check the context. Right. In the last paragraph, it says, a long uncomfortable silence filled the hall. The Amnesty panel, the legal representatives, the audience, all seemed distressed or upset. Kosi turned away slowly, his hands clutched, held together. In a newspaper interview afterwards, Miss Kondile said, it is easy for Mandela and Tutu to forgive. They led vindicated or transformed lives. In my life, nothing, not a single thing has changed since my son was buried by barbarians or thugs. Nothing. Therefore, I cannot forgive. So why did she choose not to forgive? She's talking about it being easy for Mandela and Tutu to forgive. We are looking at Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, the leader of the TRC. And for her, it was not easy. And she even told that they led a vindicated or a transformed life. And to her, nothing was changed. So the meaning of that, why she chose not to forgive, we can say she chose not to forgive because she was pained so much by the death of her son. The death of her son pained her so much that she could not forgive anyone who caused the death of her very own son. And for that reason, she could not forgive because she was exposed to the extreme pain of the loss of her own son. Pain of the loss. She could not forgive because of the pain that she went through as her son was murdered. And also, if you check, she's talking about Mandela and Tutu having their lives transformed, and her life, nothing changed. So we might also figure out that she was expecting her life to be transformed for the better through her son. These guys who are fostering forgiveness, they had their lives transformed. They had benefits in the New South Africa. That was why they were forging for and preaching the gospel of forgiveness. But to her, she did not receive anything positive on her side. So we can figure it in the perspective that she was expecting her life to be transformed through her son. But unfortunately, her son was murdered and was buried by the barbarians. So it was another reason why she would not forgive. You cannot forgive someone who murdered a person who had potential to take care of your welfare. And at the end, you remain the most vulnerable and poor person because the very same person was murdered by someone who was working for the will of the apartheid government. And we can also argue that she was in pain, for she could not bury her own son. Remember, this guy was murdered, and they only managed to do a spiritual burial of his remains, but not the physical burial of his remains. So the pain that she had, that she could not be afforded a chance to bury her own son, it was very painful for her to just have your son disappear. You don't even get the remains of the dead body, and you cannot bury anything as a symbol to remember the dead son. So she was pained by not burying her own son. So she did not afford to forgive, not burying her own son. Right. Let's figure out the other response, the other question. We're now going to source C. Right. Explain why this photograph could be very important to the Kondile family. The photograph is here. The photograph below was taken at Sizwe Kondile Spiritual Repatriation or Return. It was published in the Eastern Cape local newspaper, Eyewitness News, dated 1 July 2016. It depicts Sizwe Kondile's family members, namely Bantu Kondile, who was Sizwe's son, Nompumelelo Sizwe, Nompumelelo was Sizwe's sister, and Kwezi, Sizwe's nephew, and Pati Kondile, Sizwe's cousin, together with the Fusipi Koli at the site at Komatput on 30 June 2016, where they performed his spiritual repatriation or his return. Right. That one is Fusipi Koli speaking on behalf of the Kondile family. Right. So we come and check the question. Explain why this photograph could be very important to the Kondile family. Why this photograph could be very important. Right. One, we can say it serves as a memory of the late family member. It serves as a very critical and crucial memory. They get to remember their dead family member whenever they see that photo. And also we can talk of it being important as fostering the unity in the family. whenever they get to see that photo, they remember that they are united as a family because they got together to remember and repatriate the spirit of the dead as a family. So it fosters a unity of the family. Is very important for that purpose. And also, to them, it's important because it fosters friendship. The presence of Vusi Piccoli is a symbol of friendship. He had worked with the late and had gone to Lesotho together into exile and had formed the underground operation in South Africa together as a friend and as a colleague in the workplace. So it fosters friendship for the family. They will always remember that they befriended very well with Vusi Piccoli. Then move on to the next question. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, comment on why Vusi Piccoli joined the Kondile family. I think I have highlighted some of the importance there. We have heard of Vusi Piccoli earlier on in the first source. Why did he join? The reason is clear why he was there. He once worked together with the late. He worked together with the late. And also, you can justify his presence there. They formed the underground cell together with the late family member. It was Vusi who was there again when they formed the underground movement. And also, we can say why he was also there. We can talk of him being a friend, was a close friend. Besides being a workmate, was a close friend to the late. Then his presence was justified. Right. Comment on whether you think the spiritual repatriation of Sizwe Kondile could have brought closure to his family for the lack of his burial. Whether you think the spiritual repatriation, we are burying the spirit of someone, bringing back the spirit of someone who died, whom we did not bury physically. Did the family find closure? Them remembering about a fellow family member who died in the hands of apartheid and they could not afford him a decent burial. Now they were just doing a symbolic burial for him. Would they get closure? In my perspective, you can argue that they got closure, but you have to justify. In my perspective, I would say no. Why would I say no? They did not bury the physical remains. They will still be pained by the fact that they are just having a symbolic burial without the physical remains of their very loved one, their very fellow family member. So, in my perspective, I think they would not get closure because they did a symbolic burial, but rather than a physical burial. We know when someone is dead, it's supposed to be buried physically. We're supposed to recognize a grave of someone who has been buried physically, whom we know that the remains are there in the grave. But now we're just doing a symbolic burial. I think they would not get closure to that. Right, moving on to the next source. Quote from the source, any 4 ways indicating how Sizwe Kondile died at the hands of the police. 4 ways indicating how Sizwe Kondile. Right, we go to the source. The opening paragraph, the context of the source, it says the article below is from Independent Online, a South African media platform dated 2 July 2016. It highlights aspects from the speech of the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services, Michael Mashuta, during the burial of Sizwe Kondile's spiritual remains at Freedom Park on 1 July 2016. Right. It says Johannesburg, poisoned, tortured, shot, burned, and bombed. This was how Sizwe Kondile died at the hands of apartheid police. So one way is poisoning, poisoned. Second one, tortured. Third, shot. Fourth, burned. Fifth, bombed. So out of those 5, you pick any 4, because the question requires you to identify 4. So any 4 from those 5 is justified as a correct response. Number 242, comment on why a spiritual repatriation was necessary for the Kondile family. Why was it necessary for the family, for them to do that? Right, I would say there, it was necessary to symbolize the burial of their loved one. Sizwe Kondile. It was necessary to symbolize his burial. And also I can say it was necessary to unite his spirit with his family. Remember, he died in the hands of the apartheid thugs, and his spirit was supposedly not united with his family. So it was also necessary to unite his spirit with the family. Remember, as Africans, we have that belief. So it was also necessary to unite his spirit with his family. And also we can say to afford him spiritual rest. As part of the beliefs of Africans, we believe that if an individual is improperly buried or has died in a tragic way, they do not find rest until they are remembered by their very own family and rituals are done in that perspective. So it was very necessary for them to do that event. Right, explain why a historian might consider this a reliable source for researching the symbolic burial of Sizwe Kondile. We are looking at, here it's a question of reliability. And the reliability we are saying, is this trusted? Is this a source telling us the truth about the symbolic burial of Sizwe Kondile? Right. Now, before we look at that, let's look at question 243. Why did Masuta believe the ceremony in 2016 was a moment of reflection for all of us? The minister he said it was a moment of reflection for all of us. Right. Basically, that one means that it reminded people of the cruel past or the history of apartheid. It's a reflection. We are taking ourselves back to history. We are reflecting on what was happening in the past. So it reminded people of the cruel past or the history of apartheid. Or we can say it was a moment to remember all those who sacrificed their lives in the struggle against apartheid. We are reflecting and getting to remember and honor those ones who sacrificed their lives for the sake of the struggle against oppression. Then explain the reliability here. Right, how can we say it's reliable? Right, it's reliable because there's a speech of the Minister of Justice and Correctional Service. It being a speech from the Minister of Justice and Correctional Service, we can safely rely on that. And also it mentions the presence of Vusi Pikoli, who has been Kondile's best friend. So it's reliable. If it is mentioning the very key feature who was with the late, we can safely rely. That presence of Vusi Pikoli is also mentioned today. We can safely rely because we know the history of him working together with the late Kondile. So it's also reliable. And also we can say it can be corroborated with other sources. It's talking of Vusi Pikoli, and if you've also checked source A, was also talking of reciprocally being involved. And if you check the other sources also, they are talking about the TRC report where people are seeking for amnesty for the murder of the late Sizwe Kondile. So it can be corroborated with other sources. And also it mentions reciprocally, who is a critical feature in the life of the dead, the late Sizwe Kondile, and also the minister's speech. Right. Then 2.5, refer to source 2b and 2d. Explain how the information in source 2d differs from the evidence in source 2b regarding bringing closure to the Kondile family. That one is a contrast. We want to look at evidence which is differing or which is not agreeing to each other. Right. If we check source 2b, it talks about Kondile's mother, Charity, who could not forgive. If we check that source, it says the mother could not forgive. In source 2b. Therefore, I cannot forgive. And then what happens here? This one here talks about rituals giving family. Participating in the rituals gave families answers, closure, and understanding of the whole situation, which meant that is differing. This one has got a positive aspect. Families are getting answers. They're getting closure. They're getting to understand the whole situation. If you're getting closure, it means you are now in a position to be able to forgive because you have understood the whole situation. Someone was murdered. Yes, we accept that we can no longer replace him. He is dead already. Then we accept it. We get closure. We get answers and we forgive. But however, in the first source, in source 2b, Kondile, mother Charity, completely refused to forgive. So it's differing. And again, if we check source 2b saying, we come here, it says, it is easy for Mandela and Tutu to forgive. Their lives were transformed. In my life, nothing, not a single thing has changed. She's claiming that in her life, nothing, not a single thing has changed since the son was buried by barbarians. How does it differ? She's saying she's not changed. Nothing has changed. But here, it's claiming that the ceremony afforded families much needed closure. The same ceremony afforded the families much needed closure in this source, which means it's differing. When families are getting closure, yeah, ceremony afforded families much needed closure. It means there is a change in their life. They were pained, yes, of the past, but now they are transformed because they are getting closure. So that is differing. That one is saying, supposed to be saying, nothing has changed in her life. She's still being pained by the death of her son who was buried by barbarians, and she's still in pain and she cannot forgive. But this one is saying families were afforded the much needed closure, which means there is differences there between those two sources. And also, if you check source 2b, source 2b says, my son was buried by barbarians or thugs. And here, how does it differ? It says, talks of the symbolic burial. The symbolic burial which took place in Freedom Park. So it's differing. This one is talking about symbolic burial, which is decent burial of the dead, though it's spiritual repatriation. But they could not afford a chance to bury their own loved one. It was buried by barbarians and thugs. So it's differing there. Those are the differences that you can figure out. And remember, you must show the contrast in the required or in the appropriate way. Source 2D says Kondile was buried by barbarians, which is different from source 2D, which says there was symbolic burial which took place in Freedom Park. That is how you differentiate those two sources. Right, we'll move on to the paragraph question. In the paragraph question, as usual, you answer it the same way, the Peel way, how you answer your paragraphs in the essays. We don't need to spend much time. So in your paragraph, you must have a point, your explanation, your evidence, and your link. Right, your point, the question is saying, explaining whether the TRC was able to bring closure to Sizwe Kondile's family. That is the question. So this one, it now depends with your evidence. We want to assess whether the TRC was able to bring closure to the Sizwe Kondile family. Whichever side you are going to take, you must be able to explain it and be able to support it with evidence, and then you link your paragraph. You can choose to say the TRC failed to bring closure to the family. Failed to bring closure. That is your line of argument, or that is your answer to the question. Or in another dimension, you can say the TRC was able to bring closure, or succeeded in bringing closure, or it brought closure to the family. But however, it now depends with your argument, how you are going to support your line of argument. If you said it brought closure to the family, or if you said it did not bring closure to the family, you should be able to explain it and give evidence. Like, for example, if you choose to say it did not bring closure, you can say the family was still pained by the loss of their loved one, and they could not find closure. And to make matters worse, they did not find the remains of their loved ones. They were only composed to do a symbolic burial of their loved one. Then you go to find evidence to show that they did not find closure. You talk of the mother in that source where she claimed that she cannot forgive. Or you quote the statement of the lawyer where he said the perpetrator was not sorry for what he did, for his actions. If he was sorry, he was supposed to face the consequences, which means that the family did not get closure. That is one dimension. If you want to say the TRC brought closure, then you explain and you support. The TRC was able to bring the perpetrators together with the family of the murdered Sizwe together to hear the testimony. Then what happened after that? To show that there was closure to the family was able to do a repatriation of the dead, a spiritual repatriation. The family was able to unite with the late close friend and come together for the ceremony. So you are now giving justification as evidence that you find from the different sources to show that the family got a closure from that particular event which was held by the TRC. And lastly, you link to your line of argument. So be mindful that whichever side you adopt, you must be able to explain it and give evidence from the sources, and then you are supposed to link. There should be no argument which wanders around. If you are saying the TRC was able to bring closure, then we hold it in that direction and you explain and give evidence in that direction. Or if you say it did not bring closure, then you hold it in that direction and be able to explain and give evidence and link it to your line of argument, which is your answer to the question. That brings us to the end of question number 2. Right. We are not going to look at globalization. We are going to look at the essay question, which is question number 4 and 5. Right. We have civil resistance in the 1970s to 1980s, the crisis of apartheid in the 1980s. Right. Our core focus for this question, we know, is Black consciousness. That is our core focus for that particular question. We focus on the influence of Black consciousness on Black societies in the fight against apartheid. Right. So let's look at our question. We are going to be as brief as is possible. We just want to highlight on key aspects and be able to figure out how best we can answer those questions. Right. Looking at our question is based on The Black Consciousness by Steve Biko and the fellow colleagues who fought through the different forms of resistance and mobilizing different groups of African society to challenge the apartheid regime. Right. The question says, explain to what extent Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness philosophy inspired Black people to empower themselves against apartheid in the 1960s and 1970s. Use relevant historical evidence to support your line of argument. Right, when we're looking at this question here, we check the context, we check the nature of the question. The question says, explain to what extent. That is the setup of the question. Remember, we have 3 questions, just briefly. Our questions come in 3 settings, right? Is to what extent. And that is question number, that is setup number 1. Setup number 2 is, do you agree? Setup number 3 is critically discuss. So before you answer the question, you need to give, before you write your explanations, you need to give an answer to the question. You need to give a direct response to the question, or what we call a line of argument. When the question says to what extent, you need to show the extent, whether it's greater extent or lesser extent, depending on your evidence and how you're going to explain and support your line of argument. So before you explain anything, show the extent. To a greater extent, this. To a lesser extent, this. Do you agree? It's either you're in agreement or you are in disagreement. You are in full agreement or you are in partial agreement. So when the question says, do you agree, make sure that you address the agreement part. That is what is required by the question, and that is how you adopt your line of argument, depending on how you want to argue in the presentation. If a question says critically discuss, it means you need to approve the statement or you need to disapprove the statement. Approving the statement, you are saying the statement is positive, can be supported with historical evidence, is correct historically. Disapproving, you are saying the statement is wrong. It cannot be supported with historical evidence. So you need to answer the question first. That is what you should do in your introduction. Then, again, in your introduction, after answering the question, you need to give a reason, a general reason why you are answering the question in that direction. Then you give an elaboration, which is an orientation to the reader. What historical evidence are you going to use in the essay? What are you going to prove in the essay? What historical content are you going to present in the essay? That's the orientation. So your introduction should basically have those 3: an answer to the question or the line of argument, or a direct response to the question. Like what we have indicated here, to those 3 questions, you need to address them in the given ways. And secondly, a general reason. Why are you arguing in that direction? You give a general reason. Then lastly, you give an elaboration. So going back to our question, giving an example of an introduction, explain to what extent Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness. You would say, to a greater extent, Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness philosophy inspired Black people to empower themselves against apartheid. Or you can say, to a larger extent, it is Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness philosophy that inspires Black people to empower themselves against apartheid in the 1960s. As your opening statement. You have shown the extent, you have answered the question. Then why are you saying so? You give general reasons. Black consciousness was able to feel up the political vacuum against resistance to apartheid, which was created by the banning of political parties. Or Black consciousness was able to instill Black people with a sense of pride and identity to effectively challenge apartheid. It's a general reason. Or it is Black consciousness that made Black people self-reliant through community projects and not rely on the apartheid government. You are showing. Or it is through Black consciousness that Black workers were able to gather and fight for their rights in the workplace. You are giving a general reason as to why you are saying, to a greater extent, Black consciousness was able to inspire and empower Black people against apartheid. Then you give an elaboration. What is the essay going to prove? This essay is going to further elaborate on the impact of Black consciousness on Black people to empower themselves. Or this essay is going to give or to shed more light on how Black consciousness was used as a tool to empower Black people. You have shown the reader what you're going to prove in the essay. Then, do not worry much about background information. We know the background information that we have for this essay question is the vacuum which was created by the banning of political parties after the Sharpeville massacre. Right, that is background information, and I advise you not to spend much time. If you want to include the background, just write one paragraph of background information, because I guarantee you that there are no marks for the background. You don't need to waste time because you're not answering the question. The question is on how Black consciousness inspired Black people to empower themselves. So if you dwell much on the background information, that does not answer the question and cannot give you marks for that question. You need to answer the question. So the background, I'll just give you a brief background of the Black consciousness. Right, the Black consciousness was a philosophy. It came after the banning of political parties. Remember the Sharpeville massacre? During the Defiance campaign, people were protesting against the past laws. People in the Val Township, the likes of Seroke, the likes of the Val Triangle, people in those townships in the Val Triangle, they were very active against apartheid. They were very active in their protests against apartheid and leading to the Sharpeville massacre. And at the end, the government felt like they were now losing grip over their very own people. And they chose to ban the political parties that were influencing Black people to challenge apartheid. ANC and PAC were banned. Officially, those political parties were non-existent in South Africa. They were deemed as banned organizations or illegal and undesired organizations. They were banned, which meant that, and also the government imposed a state of emergency in a way to try and control any uprising against it. So it meant that there was very little resistance by that time. The influencers of mass mobilization, the ANC, were banned. And however, much of the activists, again, they were in exile and some were operating underground. Some were in prison after the Rivonia trial. So there was very little resistance amongst the Black community. They were not resisting against the apartheid government, which prompted the need for a new way of resistance against apartheid. Because from 1960s until the 1968 or 1970s, there was very little resistance as the political parties were banned. So it left a political vacuum. There was a vacuum which was created, meaning to say there was no more resistance to apartheid. The apartheid government was now relaxed because it had managed to repress all resistance by banning the PAC and ANC. Right. Then after that, the background, you go straight to your essay. You explain Black consciousness, maybe as a philosophy. How was Black consciousness operating? It was a matter of the mind. It helped in instilling a sense of pride. Black people were supposed to be proud of themselves. They were supposed to believe in themselves. So it was a way of challenging apartheid by believing that we are also a unique group on our own. Unlike just believing that the whites are the ones who are superior, it was now changing the mentality of Black people into making them believe that they are also superior according to their own understanding as a unique group. And also You can, it's a paragraph on its own, explaining Black consciousness, instilling a sense of pride amongst the Black people. Or you can talk of Black consciousness as a way of instilling cultural identity. Black people were supposed to identify themselves by their culture and not to fall prey and not to be abused by the white society culture and not to imitate the white society culture. So they were supposed to identify themselves as a culturally unique group on their own. It's made of the mind. And then you can talk of Steve Biko breaking away from NUSAS to form SASO, National Union for South African Students. This was a white-dominated institution at university, whereby Black people or Black students could not expose themselves because it was dominated by the whites. And also they had accepted a policy of separate amenities at the university. So they were not happy. They formed their own organization. What was the benefit here? The benefit was that their ideology would flourish because now they were sharing the common ideology in SASO. So it was another move of breaking away, of justifying and supporting Black people in their fight against the oppression by the white apartheid government. Right. And then we can also talk of the Black People's Convention. It was Black Consciousness People's Convention, which was a gathering of different civic organizations. The churches and other civic organizations, they formed the Black People's Convention, whereby they would come together and discuss critical issues affecting the welfare of the Black person and come out with solutions, and also fostering unity and solidarity amongst the Black people to challenge apartheid. You explain it as a paragraph and you link it back to the line of argument. And also, we can talk of the influence of Black consciousness on trade unions or on labor in general. It was Black consciousness that helped Black workers to realize their self-worth in the workplace. Black workers were suppressed in the workplace, their rights were disobeyed. So through Black consciousness, they were now able to arise and defend themselves in the workplace and be able to have their rights respected. And remember, I can give an example of the Durban tile workers. It was one of the major strikes that happened in South Africa because of the influence of the Black consciousness. Or we can talk of the Black Allied Workers Union. It was formed as a result of the influence of Black consciousness, whereby workers were conscientizing each other and fighting for their rights in the workplace and not falling prey to suppression by the white employer. Then we can talk also of trade unionism. We can talk of self-reliance through projects, community projects. And there are several examples that you can give there. The Black people were having their own self-reliance projects, whereby they were trying to sustain on their own and not rely on the government. And also remember, the government was happy because it thought it was adopting a policy of separate development. So the government seeing a Black man trying to sustain on himself, they were very happy with that, not knowing that it was going to be a challenge to their apartheid practices. So it's also another movement. Can give examples of this, an MPLO community center. There are so many examples that you can give on that one. Then you can also talk of Black consciousness on the media, the influence of Black consciousness on the media, how Black consciousness ideas were spread through the media. We talk of Steve Biko publishing his writings across the country before they were banned to try and influence Black people to know their rights and to have their rights respected through the different forms that were used. Then you can also talk of Black consciousness on political parties, how Black consciousness was influencing political parties. Though the political parties were banned, but remember, it revived the spirit of fighting against the apartheid government. knowing that black people were being conscientized through black consciousness, the political parties also got the belief that one day they are going to take over and be able to control the nation of South Africa as an independent state from the suppression of apartheid, right? And also you can talk of black consciousness on student movement, on SASIM, and apparently you can talk of the Soweto uprising, 1976. The Soweto uprising was also attributed to black consciousness because of the influence that was put by black consciousness on the South African student movement, right? And also there are lots of things that you can say on that essay. So if you're able to create, paragraphs on the above mentioned points, you would come out with a very good essay. And remember, you should have a clear point at the opening of your paragraph, and then the paragraph should be supported with evidence where you give examples, you explain the point, and you give evidence to the point as in examples and as in statistics, as in names, as in names of figures, names of places, whatever you can figure out as evidence in the paragraph. And then you are linked back to your line of argument to show that you are arguing in a given direction. Then you come to your conclusion. Coming to your conclusion, you indicate that you are now ending your discussion. You can use some indicative terms to show that you are now ending your conclusion. And remember, we are not having any highlighting, any underlining, or any subheadings in the essay. We are writing continuously from the introduction until we get to the last part. What should your conclusion do? We talked about the introduction. Your conclusion, when you are concluding your essay, it should tie up your argument. Or you're saying you can reaffirm key aspects of the discussion. That is how you conclude. You reaffirm the key aspects, and your conclusion should be contextualized. It should be in the context of what you were discussing. It should not disagree with what you were discussing in the essay. It should be in line with your discussion in the essay. Then you know that you are tying up your discussion. Like, for example, you can tie up your argument by showing conclusively the above evidence undoubtedly proves that black consciousness played a key role in. However, you go back to the question. How is the question phrased? Like, our question is phrased in the way that black consciousness inspired black people. So you can say conclusively, the above evidence undoubtedly proves that black consciousness philosophy inspired black people to empower themselves. Then you can reaffirm a key point. It was through black consciousness that black people got to realize their self-worth in South African society, leading to ultimate independence in 1994. You have tied up your conclusion. Or whichever way, you can also conclude. Like, in conclusion, one can safely conclude that black consciousness played a pivotal role in inspiring black people to empower themselves against apartheid. Black people were able to do away with self-pity and realize their self-worth until they managed to get their independence. So we are just tying up our argument. We are just tying up our argument in the same direction of how we are arguing, and we cannot introduce something new that we did not mention about in the essay. Like, we cannot talk of something that is out of context. in the conclusion. We just tie up our argument by reaffirming what we have said. Reaffirming, we are saying we are giving an emphasis to what we think is most important. Like, we feel like black workers, if it was not black consciousness, they would have been exposed to suppression in the workplace forever. So we want to reaffirm that it was black consciousness which helped black workers to empower themselves in the workplace and fight for their rights. We are reaffirming the point, but not repeating it the way we expressed it in the essay. So that is basically how we tie up our argument and how we conclude our essays. And I usually encourage you learners to raise as many points as is possible. You must not limit yourself by writing. Maybe you have raised 6 points. You say it's now 3 pages because I now have these 6 points. Then my essay should come to an end because it has now reached 3 pages. The suggestion is your essay should be about 3 pages long. About 3 pages long, which means it's not maximum 3 pages. Write as much as you can. And your paragraphs should be standard. Do not write too long paragraphs. Just write a standard paragraph, plus or minus 8 lines, with the basic requirements of a paragraph: a clear point, which answers the question, an explanation, evidence or examples. You link back to a line of argument. Linking back, either you are linking directly to the question or you link to the next paragraph, so that you have variety of links and you do not end up creating a chorus in your essay. You should not end your paragraphs with the same statement, paragraph after paragraph. That is not it's not academic writing. We are not singing. We can only have choruses in songs, not in essays. So you should vary your links by linking back to the question, by giving any statement which supports the question or the line of argument, or by referring to the next paragraph, giving a variety of links so that your essay becomes a proper academic essay. Right, let's move on to the next question. We've come to the conclusion of that question. We come on to the next question. Right, next question is saying, question number 5, the coming of democracy to South Africa and the coming to terms with the past. Our focus there is the negotiated settlement. I think everyone knows. We are looking at the negotiation process that happened between the major players in the politics of South Africa, the ANC and the National Party. Right. So looking into that, we want to look at the events which unfolded for South Africa to get to negotiation process and the disturbing violence until we get to independence in 1994. Right. Although the negotiation process was plagued with violence, various political parties were willing to compromise to lay a firm foundation for a democratic South Africa in 1994. Do you agree with the statement? Use relevant historical evidence to support your line of argument. So in this instance, we are asked to agree or to disagree. And in this direction, I strongly urge you to agree with the statement. Because if you disagree with the statement, then what are you going to say in the essay? Or what is going to be your evidence in the essay? Definitely your essay will be meaningless because you won't have any evidence in the essay. Or you won't be having any responses as answers to the essay. Because we know historically that the negotiation process was as a result of compromise of the different political parties. And also, it was typically experiencing incidences of unending violence. So that is clear. We have to agree with the statement. So opening up our introduction, we can say, in agreement with the statement that although the negotiation process was plagued with violence, various political parties were willing to compromise to lay a firm foundation for a democratic South Africa in 1994. We are agreeing with the statement. Or this essay fully agrees with the statement that although the negotiation process was plagued with violence, various political parties were willing to compromise to lay a foundation for a democratic South Africa in 1994. Then you give evidence of instances of violence, or you give evidence of the compromise which was done. You can give evidence of compromise by citing the record of understanding, which was signed on 26 September 1992. This was evidenced by the signing of the record of understanding between Rolf Meyer and Cyril Ramaphosa after the negotiations came to a deadlock. Or you can give both evidence of compromise and also evidence of violence. The assassination of Chris Hani as an incident of violence brought the negotiation and the whole of South Africa into a chaotic situation. It was incident of violence, the murder of a key player in the negotiation process. So you give evidence to show that there was violence, and to show, you can talk of the Bishop massacre. It was also an incident of violence. You can talk of the violence in the Val, or you can talk of rolling mass action as examples of violence. So that is your evidence. Then you go on to elaborate. What is the essay going to prove? This essay is going to focus on instances of violence that happened during negotiation, and also the compromise which was shown by the players in the negotiation process for South Africa to become a democratic in 1994. Right. Then you go to your answer to the question. Your answer is focused on instances of violence and instances of compromise by political players in the negotiation process. So I'll just highlight some of the key aspects. Like the brief background, you talk of de Klerk coming to power, and you talk of his first speech in parliament on 2 February. It was on the 2nd of February in 1990. This is brief background. We're talking of de Klerk coming to power after P.2 Botha suffered a stroke, and then de Klerk came to power, and then de Klerk was later on elected for a full 5-year term as the president of South Africa. Then he promised in his first speech in parliament on the 2nd of February 1990, he promised a better South Africa. He said an era of violence had come to an end, which meant that he was showing compromise, and he opted to offer a release of political prisoners and banning of political parties and civic organizations. So he explained this and banning of civic organizations and political parties. It shows that there was of the ANC and the PAC, which were banned in 1960. He unbanned them. He showed compromise there by banning the civic organizations and also the political parties, which were banned in 1990. And also, we look at the release of Nelson Mandela. Release of Nelson Mandela. How did it impact? It paved the way for negotiation. After 27 years, Nelson Mandela was finally released under de Klerk's rule. So it paved the way for negotiations. Was a key player who was supposed to be involved in the negotiation and was now released from prison, meaning that he paved the way for the event of negotiation to start taking place since he was now out of prison. And what was the first, the Groot-Schuur minute? You explained the Groot-Schuur minute, what was agreed there, and on which date did it happen. The Groot-Schuur, we know, was on the 2nd of May, 1990. On the 2nd of May, 1990, the ANC and National Party met Nelson Mandela being the leader of the ANC, and de Klerk being the leader of the National Party. You explain how the event unfolded, what was agreed. That is basically what you should explain on the route scar, and you show that it was a matter of compromise for those to come to play and come to a discussion table. It was compromise. And then you can also talk of the Pretoria Minute after that. It was another negotiation event which happened on the 6th of August, 1990. 6th of August, 1990. What was agreed there, you highlight that the ANC, in good faith, opted to suspend the armed struggle. They now offered to do away with their armed wing, the Umkhonto weSizwe. But however, they kept with Operation Vula, which was an emergency plan in case the government disobeys its commitment. And then we can also talk of an interim government. Then we can also talk of CODESA number 1, Convention for a Democratic South Africa number 1. We discuss. Then we talk of violence in the Rand in Natal. Disturbing violence in the Rand area in Natal. The attack on infrastructure, sabotages on infrastructure, sabotage attacks on infrastructure. That was incident of violence, which was disturbing violence. So you show that it was disturbing violence. It was affecting the ongoing negotiation process because of the violence which was spreading across the country. Then you go to CODESA number 2. That was and before that, you can also talk of the whites-only referendum. Before CODESA 2, you can talk of whites-only referendum, whereby the whites wanted to see if it was relevant for them to continue with the negotiation, and also the impact. It showed that whites were interested in negotiations because they were negatively impacted by the violence across the country. Their businesses were no longer functional. There were sanctions against the economy of South Africa. Everything was going down. So they wanted to pave the way for a new viable economy. So they voted in favor of the negotiation process to continue. Then we go to CODESA number 2. Then we look at what happened. Then also disturbing violence, talk of rolling mass action. Rolling mass action by resistance organizations, whereby there were strikes and boycotts. And what was the impact? They wanted to speed up the negotiation. They were feeling like the process was getting slow. They wanted to speed up the process. That was why there was rolling mass action. Across the whole country, there was instances of boycotting and strikes and violence across the country so that the negotiation will come to a quick conclusion to decide for the future of the country. Then we can also talk of the P.2 massacre as disturbing violence. This one is disturbing violence. There was violence in P.2 and its consequences. That was on 17 June 1992. As evidence, to give the date. And it was there was an inquiry. There was a commission which was set to investigate on the violence, to discuss, to come to a conclusion or a finding of the source of the violence, and it was discovered to be more of a third force. Then we can also talk of the Bisho massacre. It's one of the disturbing violent events, the Bisho massacre. And that was on the 7th of September, 1992. Instance of violence, it was disturbing violence again in the Ciskei homeland, whereby the armed police officers shot on civilians, accusing them of going out into the South African Republic without documentation. And also, it almost broke the negotiation process. It derailed the negotiation process it affected the negotiation. So you cite it as instance of disturbing violence in the negotiation process. Then we also have the record of understanding. Record of understanding. This was signed between Rolf Meyer and Cyril Ramaphosa. That was on the 26th of September, 1992. Right, it shows sacrifice, this one. It shows great commitment by the players or the leaders in the negotiation process. Remember, after the Bisho massacre, there was the deadlock whereby political parties were no longer willing to come to the negotiation table. But however, it took the sacrifice of Rolf Meyer, who was the Minister of Constitutional Affairs, and Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the Secretary for the ANC, to come to the discussion table and pave way for negotiations by signing the record of understanding on the 26th of September 1992. So when you are linking this point, you link it to the fact that it was out of mere compromise by the leaders in the negotiation process to come to the discussion table after a deadlock. Right, we go on to, after the record of understanding, we go to the multi-party negotiation, which was multi-party negotiation process, which was on 2 April 1993 rather. Then we go on to other disturbing violence, the assassination of Chris Hani. You explain its impact was a disturbing violence, which almost derailed the negotiation process. And it was only the commitment of Nelson Mandela to go on national TV to try and calm down the situation in the whole of South Africa after the assassination of Chris Hani. Then we can also talk of the continuation of the discussions at World Trade Center, whereby there was disturbing violence by the right-wing AWB, who came to disrupt the negotiation process. The AWB, who came to disrupt the negotiation process at the World Trade Center. Then we can also look at the Heidelberg Tavern massacre, where 26 people were massacred. This was in June. This one was June 1993. Then we go on to the Tavern massacre, the Heidelberg Tavern massacre. And we go on to the interim constitution in 1993 November. There was the interim constitution. Interim constitution that was in November 1993. Then the Shell House massacre in March 1994 is disturbing violence. Shell House massacre of 1994 in March. Then lastly, we go on to the elections on 27 April 1994. 27 April 1994 election. And what was the result? ANC won, and Nelson Mandela became the first Black South African president. That is where your negotiation process ends. So you see, it's a series of negotiation processes that happened starting from 1990, when Nelson Mandela was released, for 4 years, spanning for 4 years until 1994, when the first election for a democratic South Africa was held. And the resounding victory was in favor of ANC under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, who rose to become the first Black president for South Africa, for a democratic South Africa. So when you're explaining these events, you need to explain them and you need to link to show that it was a compromise process by the leaders, and also to show that it was a violent event which was disturbing, because you have agreed that there was compromise and also there was violence. So you must always be supporting your line of argument in your discussion and showing by linking back to your line of argument to show whether it was disturbing violence or it was an act of a compromise by the leaders in the discussion in the negotiation process. So basically that brings us to the end of the points answering the question. Then you tie up your discussion by giving a contextualized conclusion. You contextualize, you tie up your argument, or you reaffirm key aspects of your discussion within the context of the discussion, which means within the context of your line of argument, because your line of argument is agreeing that there was compromise and also there was disturbing violence. So you link it in that direction. Like, for example, it is clear based on the above historical argument that the negotiation process, though it was having violent events, it took the compromise of the leaders to get to a democratic South Africa. You are tying up your argument to show that there was violence and there was compromise. Then you can further on add the role that was played by Nelson Mandela was a significant role that transformed South Africa into this present South Africa, a democratic one. You are reaffirming the fact that Nelson Mandela was a key player in the negotiation process, was a key person in compromising in the negotiation process. So you reaffirm your key points, or you tie up your argument, and your conclusion should be in context of the question which is asked, or your line of argument. Right, basically, learners, that brings us to the end of our discussion. I hope the discussion will be helpful and will assist you in answering paper 2 questions as a guide, and also answering future paper 2 questions, because basically the essays will be the same. What is going to be different is the way the questions are presented, and they will vary within those 3 contexts, like what we've mentioned earlier on, the setup of our 3 questions in history. So I believe based on my assessment of the paper, I feel the paper is a very fair paper, which will make an average learner attain the highest possible grade, if not distinctions for all. It is my belief that the discussion will be helpful to you in your studies, and also will assist you in getting the skills required in answering history questions. For now, I rest my case. Your host, as usual, Conrad Mpinguri. Thank you. Good day, learners. Welcome to the MEMO discussion for History Paper 2, 2024. Right, as usual, we have a rundown through the paper and start the discussion of the basic questions that we have in the paper. Remember, as usual, the setup of the paper does not change. We know it's 3 source-based questions and 3 essay questions, of which the choice must be either 2 source-based questions and 1 essay, or 2 essays and 1 source-based question. Right, let's start with our first question. The first question, we know the core focus is on civil resistance, or on internal resistance to apartheid in the 1980s. We look at the different organizations that came into play to resist the rule of apartheid and to emancipate Black people in their fight against oppression from apartheid practices by the National Party government. Right, if we check our question here, the question is solely focused on civic organizations. When we're looking at civic organizations, we are looking at those groupings of people in the townships, including different organizations like the churches, community members coming together to rally behind the fight against oppression and the rule of apartheid. So the focus of this question number 1, is how did civic organizations mobilize local communities to resist apartheid government structures in South Africa in the 1980s? And remember, when you get such a focus of the question, that is where you're going to get your paragraph question, which is the last question, an 8-mark question for the source-based question. So as you read through the sources, as you extract information for the other questions, you should also try to figure out evidence which supports the question, because you will need it when you are answering the paragraph question as evidence. So you need to highlight wherever you find evidence of how civic organizations mobilized our local communities. It's evidence to the paragraph question so that you don't waste time when you're answering the paragraph question. You just refer to the highlighted evidence that you would have got when you are looking for information to answer the other questions. Right, question number 1.11. Name the bill in the source that was introduced by the apartheid government in 1980 to create local government structures. Right, this one is an extraction question. Remember the setup of our questions. If you see a 1 by 1, it means it's an extraction question. It's a level 1 question where you don't need to scratch your head thinking of the response, but you go to the given source and you extract your response. Let's look at the response from the source. Right, if you check source 1A, how is it aligned? What is the context of the source? You should also be in a position to figure out the content in the source by reading the context of the source before you get into the source. The source below was written by D. Slinova, a research fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and faculty member of Higher School of Economics in Russia. It explores the reaction of civic organizations to the Black Local Authorities Act. That is the context of our source. So we want to find the response of the bill which was introduced by apartheid. If we go to our first part of our source, it says the government introduced the Black Local Government Bill in 1980. That is where we get our response. We get our response directly here. It says the Black Local Government Bill in 1980. That is our response to the first question, the Black Local Government Bill. Right, let's move on to the next question. Quote from the source, 2 provisions of the Black Local Authorities Act for Black residents in township. Again, it's a 2 by 1, which means it's also an extraction question. And what you should be aware of is that if it's 2 by 1, you are supposed to give 2 different responses with each response weighing 1 mark. So you must get 2 different provisions from the source, which were provided through the Black Local Authorities Act. Right, if you go to our source, right, we'll tend to find that if we come here, it says it provided for the establishment of a series of local government structures similar to those operating in white areas. This was one provision. It provided for the establishment of a series of local government structures which were similar to those operating in the white areas. Right. This implies that the government was in a position to manipulate Black people into thinking that they are having their own autonomy in the townships. They were given the mandate to form their own structures to govern themselves. But however, those structures did not have any parliamentarian representation. So they were just structures to govern the affairs of Black people in the townships, but without any say in national issues or national affairs. It was just local affairs which were supposed to be managed and governed by those authorities in the townships. That was one provision. Let's look at the other provision. It continues and says, and for the first time, it, referring to the bill, gave African residents of urban locations something like autonomy. So that is the other provision. It gave African residents of urban locations something like autonomy, which is self-government. So Black people were made into believing that they were self-governing themselves. They were having power over their own affairs. But however, their power was only localized. It had nothing to do with national affairs. They were made to decide only their local affairs affecting them in the townships, but did not have any say on issues concerning the country at large. So those were the provisions that were made through the bill, the Black Local Government Bill of 1980. Right. So we move on to the next question. List N3 problems according to the source that the newly formed civic organizations were meant to tackle or solve in their local communities. Right, again, if you check, it's a 3 by 1, it's a level 1 question. This question again is an extraction question. where you are supposed to find information from the source. You're supposed to just go to the source and extract the relevant information. We want 3 problems that were supposed to be solved by the civic organizations in their local communities. Right. If we come to our source here, what does it say? Right. Right. The second paragraph talks about the emergence of the Black local authorities, the civic organizations mushrooming or growing. Right. And then right? It talks about the committees that were formed, like the block committees, the yard committees, and the street committees. They were also formed. Then we go to where we find our response. If we come to the last statement of our second paragraph, it says, these were formed. These were formed. We're looking at those local authorities. They were formed to tackle specific problems. What were the problems that were meant to be tackled? Number 1 was high rentals. And number 2 was poor electrification. Problem number 3 was bed housing. Problem number 4 was the bucket toilet system. And problem number 5 was crime. So if we check, we have a list of 5 problems that were meant to be solved by the local authorities, by the civic organizations. Right. So, which means you're supposed to highlight any 3 of those, despite of the order or despite of which one you pick, but you're supposed to have at least identified 3 of those 5 listed problems. Problem number 1 was high rentals. The municipalities were increasing the rents for the properties that they owned where Black people were staying. And number 2, there was poor electrification. The townships did not receive adequate electricity. They were not electrified. So there were the challenge of electrification. They were supposed to tackle that problem as the local authority. Then there was also bed housing, which is also still a legacy of apartheid in South Africa. Those municipality-owned properties, they were very poor in terms of the amenities and also in terms of the appearance of the structures. So there was bed housing and also the problem of the bucket toilet system, which was also prevalent during then because of poor sanitary facilities and poor water provision. And also there was the problem of crime. So those were the problems that were meant to be addressed by those local authorities. Right. Let's go on to the next question. So that one was an instruction question. Then if you look at question number 1.14, comment on what is implied by the statement. When a question says comment, it requires you to engage with the source and also engage with your own knowledge. Comment on what is implied by the statement. Addressing these bread and butter issues automatically drove them, referring to the civic organizations, to political issues in their townships. So the question is rather saying, what is the meaning of that statement? Or what's the implication of that statement on the situation which was there in the townships? Addressing these bread and butter issues. What are bread and butter issues? We are saying the civic organizations, they were supposed to tackle their daily problems for survival. The bread and butter issues we are referring to, the basic issues that were affecting ordinary life of the people in the townships. They were affected by the basic issues like high rentals. They could not afford to pay the rents, or the problem of crime in the townships, or those problems that we have highlighted. So they were supposed to address those problems. But what was the situation? In an effort to address those problems, it drove them into political issues in their townships. So what does that mean? You are trying to address a basic problem for the betterment of your living conditions in the township, but at the same time, you are ending up being engaged in political issues. So the question here, if we are to draw the meaning of that statement, we are saying in an effort to attain decent living, the civic organizations were targeting for an ordinary Black South African to achieve a decent life. But however, they ended up confronting the government for the neglect to address these basic needs for them. It was the duty of the government, the national government in that manner, to address those problems. So they were now trying to address those problems on their own. But later on, what happened in the effort to address those problems, they ended up being in confrontation with the government, which is now political. We want a decent life. That is a bread and butter issue. We want the rentals to be reasonable and economic so that we can afford. Who is supposed to make us afford the rentals is the government. So we end up confronting the government in an effort to address those problems. So it's an issue of addressing the basic needs, but at the same time, it's leading the people into confronting the government. In solving the problems of basic needs, you ended up engaging in a fight with the government or engaging in disputes with the government, because it was the duty of the government to make sure that the citizens are well taken care of. But however, there was neglect because of the separate development policy by the apartheid government. So that is the literal meaning. That is the meaning of that particular statement. If you are to take it from the perspective of what was happening in the townships during that era of the 1980s. Right. So that is the first question. The first part of the question, number 1.1. Let's go to the next source. Source 1B. Why do you think this poster was created? Let's go to the poster. Right. Why do you think a poster was created? You check the context of the source. Before you answer the question, check the context of the source and be able to figure out what the source is about. You get a clue of the usefulness of the source or why the source was created. If you are saying why the source was created, we are saying what is the usefulness of that particular source. So let's check the context of this source. It says the poster below, produced by Krugersdorp Residents Organization, appeared on a South African History Archive. It called for the residents' meeting to be held at the Roman Catholic Church in Kagiso on 27 January 1985. Right, so why was the poster created? Is its usefulness? What is it meant to address? It is meant to call for residents' meeting. So we get the usefulness here, or the why part, to call for the residents' meeting to be held at the Roman Catholic Church in Kagiso. That is number one. It was created to call for a residents' meeting. Then what else can we say? We can also say it was meant to conscientize Blacks of the need to have their problems addressed. Because remember, the role of this meeting was to get Black people gather and discuss critical issues concerning their livelihoods. So it was also meant to conscientize the Black people of the need to have their problems addressed. They were supposed to have their problems addressed. And who was supposed to address those problems? It was the role of the Black people in collaboration with the civic associations. And also we can say the poster was created to show Black people's discontent with apartheid. Creating this poster, it was a way of showing that Black people were not happy with apartheid rule. They show their discontent. And also we can say the poster was created to call for support from the public, the Black public. To call for support. If people are being called for a meeting and the meeting is for a common cause to address problems affecting your livelihoods, then people would rally behind the civic associations. So we can say it was meant to call for the residents' meeting as in the context of the source, and also to conscientize Black people of the need to have their problems addressed, or to show Black people's discontent with the apartheid rule, or to rally for support from the Black public. Right. We move on to the next question. Explain why it is important for Dr. Motlana to speak about the role of civic associations during the residents' meeting. Right. We are looking at this poster here. It has the title, this particular character, Dr. Motlana, and also Isaac Chenu. These are the co-participants in the upcoming meeting. They are most likely to be the people to address the meeting, to tell the people the motive of the meeting, the agenda of the meeting, and why they want people's problems addressed. And so why is it important? for them to explain to the public the role of civic associations. Right. If we come to our question, we want Dr. Motlana to speak about the role of civic association during the residents' meeting. Right. The first thing there basically is to make Black people aware of the role of civics. He must